Stop believing Adam and Eve were real people. The ancient Hebrews who wrote their story never thought they were. Spinoza decoded the single Hebrew word that has been buried in plain sight for 2,000 years. There is a word, a single Hebrew word. And if you know what that word actually means and what it meant to the people who wrote it in the language they were writing in, then the entire debate about whether Adam and Eve were historical persons ends. Not with a shout, quietly, the way things end when you finally see something that was always there. I want to start with what you were told, because the gap between what you were told and what the text actually says is where this whole conversation lives. You were taught in church and Sunday school in 100 years of illustrated Bibles and sermons that treated this as settled fact, that Adam and Eve were real people, a man and a woman in a real garden, the first two human beings, the ancestors of every person who has ever lived. And if Adam and Eve were real, then what happened in the garden was real. The apple was real, the serpent was real, the expulsion was real. And the consequences that run through Christian theology from Augustine to the present, were real consequences of a real act by real people in real time. That is what you were told. And for most of Christian history, that telling was not questioned, at least not from pulpits. But the ancient Hebrews who wrote this story, the scribes and theologians who composed Genesis in its original Hebrew, who chose each word, who constructed the narrative, who knew the language the way you know your own name, they were never reading it that way. And there is a word, a single Hebrew word, that encodes everything they understood, buried in the first page of Genesis. Still there, still visible, still accessible to anyone who looks at the original text. I'm going to show it to you now. The word is Adam. In Hebrew, Aleph Dalet Mem. You know this word is a proper name. Adam, the first man, the man made from dust. But Adam, in Hebrew, is not a proper name. That is not my interpretation. That is not a revisionist reading. It is what the word means. Adam in Hebrew means humanity. It means human being in the collective generic sense. The species, the category. Not a person, but a kind of person. The same way you might say mankind or humankind. A noun referring to the class, not to an individual within it. And there is something in the grammar of Genesis that makes this completely explicit if you know to look for it. In Hebrew, proper names, personal names, names of individuals, do not take the definite article. The article in Hebrew is the letter he, attached to the front of the noun. Fa. It means the. You say ha-yom, the day, ha-shemayim, the heavens, but you do not say ha-David, the David, or ha-Moshe, the Moses. Proper names do not take definite articles. That is a grammatical rule, consistent, one of the structural features of the language. Now open Genesis and look carefully at what the text does. In the first chapters of Genesis, the chapters that introduce the character you have been calling Adam, the Hebrew word is almost always ha-Adam, with the definite article. The Adam, the human being, the humanity. That is not how you write a personal name in Hebrew. That is how you write a generic noun. The text is saying the human, not a named individual. The representative of the category. The being from whom the class takes its meaning. This is not hidden. It is right there in the grammatical structure of the original text, visible to anyone who can read biblical Hebrew, documented by scholars who have spent their careers with these texts. Richard Elliott Friedman, in his exhaustive study of biblical authorship, notes this point directly. The use of the article he before Adam in these passages is a consistent marker of the generic, not the personal. The text itself is signaling that this is not a biographical account. And here is where it gets more specific. In Genesis chapter 4, verse 25, after Cain has killed Abel, when another character enters the scene, the text finally uses Adam without the definite article, as a proper name. Because by that point, other human beings have already appeared in the narrative. The generic noun has become insufficient. The text now needs to distinguish one individual from others, and at that moment, for the first time, Adam functions as a personal name. Now listen carefully to what that tells you. If Adam had been intended as a proper name from the beginning, if the author was writing a biography of the first individual, then the article would have been absent from the start. But it is present throughout the early chapters, and absent only when narrative necessity requires distinguishing an individual from others. The grammar of Genesis in its original Hebrew is telling you that these early chapters are not about a person. They are about the human condition. And there is still more. Because the word Adam is not arbitrary. It is related to another word, Adamah. In Hebrew, it means soil, ground, earth, the substance beneath your feet. Ha-Adam from Ha-Adamah, the human from the earth, the being whose name is the name of what it came from and what it will return to. Not a man named Adam, a philosophical image of the human creature as a being of earth, formed from earth, sustained by earth, returning to earth. You do not name a historical individual this way. You construct a symbol this way. Spinoza saw it. He did not have the apparatus of modern scholarship, but he had the Hebrew text, and he had the rigor to read it without the interpretive overlay the institution had placed on top of it. And what he found was what the text itself was always saying. I want to tell you about an afternoon in Cambridge, the University Library on West Road, the tall concrete building that looks more like a government facility than a repository of ancient knowledge, but which houses in its holdings significant manuscript collections. It was perhaps 10 or 11 years ago. I had gone specifically to look at a collection of Hebrew biblical commentary, photocopied transcriptions of medieval Jewish commentary, the sort of thing that rarely appears in digitized form and requires physical travel to consult. I was working on something related to Hebrew narrative technique, how ancient Jewish interpreters handled the grammatical peculiarities of the opening chapters of Genesis. What I found was not what I had expected. Throughout the material, commentary after commentary, rabbinical authority after rabbinical authority, the question of Ha-Adam with the definite article was not treated as a problem to be explained. It was simply taken as obvious. The human, the representative of humanity. Of course. There was no need in these texts to argue that Adam was a generic noun. It was not in dispute. What the commentators were working out was what the symbol meant, what the story illuminated about the human condition, what the garden represented as an image of consciousness before moral self-awareness fully developed. They were discussing the meaning of a symbol, not the biography of an individual. The detail that stayed with me, as I sat in that library, the overhead fluorescent light cold and flat above me, the photocopy machine somewhere behind me clicking and humming, was how obvious this seemed to them. Not contentious, not heretical. The natural reading. It was the kind of moment where you realize that something you thought of as a modern critical insight is actually the recovery of a reading that was never lost in the tradition, only suppressed for certain readers. The reading was always there, in the grammar of the Hebrew, in centuries of Jewish scholarship, in the structure of the text itself. It had been buried, not deeply, but buried. But here is where the story grows more complicated and more difficult to explain away, because it is not just the word Adam that signals symbolic rather than historical intention. There is something in the structure of Genesis itself that makes the biographical reading impossible to maintain with intellectual consistency. Genesis does not have one account of creation, it has two. Read carefully and you will see them. Two distinct narratives side by side, with different vocabulary, different styles, different sequences of events, and, this is the detail that cannot be harmonized away, different names for God. The first account runs from Genesis 1 verse 1 to Genesis 2 verse 3. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The creation unfolds in sequence: light, sky, land and sea, sun and stars, creatures, and finally human beings, male and female together simultaneously on day 6. The word for God in this account is Elohim, always Elohim, a cosmic, majestic term. Then Genesis 2 verse 4 begins a different account entirely. Suddenly we are back at the beginning. The earth exists, but no shrub has yet appeared, because there was no man to work the ground. A different starting point, a different narrative concern, and the name for God changes. Not Elohim. Now it is YHWH Elohim, the personal covenant name of the God of Israel combined with the generic title. In this second account, the sequence is entirely different. First, Hey, Adam is formed from the dust. Then a garden is planted. Then animals are created. Then the woman is made, not simultaneously with the man, but from his side. Male and female created together on day 6 in account 1. Man created first, animals second, woman from man in account 2. These two stories cannot both be historical accounts of the same event. The sequences are irreconcilable, the vocabulary is different, the divine names are different. Spinoza was among the first European thinkers to identify these textual differences systematically and to draw the obvious conclusion. He did not invent the observation. Earlier commentators had noticed the variations. But he was the one who said plainly, these texts were written by different authors, human authors with different theological interests and different narrative purposes. The Bible is a library of human documents, not a single coherent historical record. That conclusion is now the scholarly consensus. Scholars call the first account the priestly source, abbreviated P, the second account the Jowist source, abbreviated J. These two documents, composed in different centuries by different authors for different purposes, were combined by editors who preserved both accounts because both mattered to the community, not because they were trying to create a single biography of Adam and Eve. Thomas Thompson, in his study of the literary architecture of the Hebrew Bible, is direct. These are literary constructions serving a theological function, not historical chronicles, which raises the question, who changed that expectation? Who decided that these theological stories needed to be read as historical accounts? Here is the answer that most people have never been given. But before I give it to you, I need to show you what Jewish readers were doing with the story of Adam and Eve in the centuries around the time of Jesus. Because what they were doing is not what the church taught you. Philo of Alexandria, 1st century of the Common Era. A Jewish philosopher living in Egypt, writing in Greek, immersed in both the Hebrew tradition and the philosophical currents of the Hellenized world, a contemporary of the events described in the New Testament. He wrote a substantial philosophical commentary on Genesis, Legum Allegoriae, the allegorical interpretation. His reading of Adam and Eve is as follows. How Adam represents the intellect, the rational capacity, the part of the human creature that perceives, reasons, contemplates the divine. Eve represents the perceptual faculty, the senses, the engagement with the material world. The serpent represents the pleasure-seeking tendency that operates through the senses, the faculty that entices the intellect to mistake sensory experience for genuine good. This is not a story Philo is constructing. He is reading it out of the text. He is saying, these are philosophical images, descriptions of the internal architecture of the human being and the drama of reason struggling against appetite. And Philo was not a heretic. He was not fringe. He was a prominent, educated, mainstream Jewish philosopher whose works were valued and studied. The way he read Genesis was the way that educated, thoughtful Jews of his period read Genesis. And Maimonides, 12th century, the greatest Jewish philosopher of the medieval period, rabbi, physician, codifier of Jewish law. In his Guide for the Perplexed, he says explicitly that the story of Adam and Eve is not a biographical account. The names designate the human intellect and the perceptual faculty. The fall is not the story of an individual. It is the story of human nature. This was not minority opinion. It was the mainstream position among educated readers. The Talmud contains multiple passages that treat Adam in ways that only make sense symbolically. Genesis Rabbah, the great midrashic commentary composed between the 3rd and 5th centuries, presents dozens of different interpretations, allegorical, philosophical, legal, with no indication that historical reality is the point at issue. The text was a field of meanings, an invitation to think about the human condition. I want to tell you about a moment in a classroom. It was around 2007. I was still teaching in my final years in the department, a lecture on allegorical interpretation in early Jewish biblical commentary. The tradition of reading that runs from Philo through into the rabbinic material. The lecture hall held perhaps 30 students. A weekday afternoon in Norwich, gray November light coming through high windows. I was going through Philo's framework, what each character represented, laying it out methodically. A student in the 3rd row, serious looking, put up his hand. He asked simply, but wasn't it always meant to be taken literally? He was genuinely asking, not challenging, with the assumption, completely natural, completely understandable, that the literal reading was the original reading and the allegorical reading was a later philosophical imposition. I remember stopping, because the question was not surprising, but what it revealed was, he had been educated in a tradition where the literal reading was so dominant, so assumed, so completely the default, that he had no framework for understanding that it had ever been otherwise. That there had been a long time, centuries across a sophisticated tradition, when the literal reading was not the question, because it was not the issue. When educated readers approach these texts expecting philosophical meaning, expecting layers of interpretation that went far beyond the surface narrative, the rupture between that reading and the one he had inherited was so complete that he could not see the rupture. That is when I understood something I had known theoretically, but not quite felt before. It is one thing to know that the allegorical tradition was suppressed. It is another to see someone for whom it has been suppressed so thoroughly that its original existence seems impossible, because something had happened, something specific, something deliberate. The tradition of allegorical reading had been replaced, and the replacement was not gradual. It had a mechanism and a date. The mechanism was Augustine of Hippo. The date was 418 of the Common Era. In Augustine's theological architecture, the doctrine of original sin is load-bearing. Everything else depends on it. The need for redemption, the nature of Christ's sacrifice, the role of grace, the purpose of the church as the vehicle of salvation, all of it rests on the claim that something happened at the beginning of human history. A real event, a real transgression. A real consequence passed from that first man to every human being who came after. But if Adam and Eve are symbols, if they are philosophical images of intellect and perception, if the garden narrative is allegory about the dynamics of human nature, then there is no original sin in the historical sense, no inherited guilt, no biological transmission of moral corruption from one specific ancestor. The entire soteriological structure built on top of that claim loses its foundation. Augustine needed Adam to be real, and the institution built on his theology needed Adam to be real. And so, in 418 of the Common Era, the Council of Carthage took a formal institutional position. It condemned explicitly anyone who denied the historical reality of Adam's sin. Not a gentle pastoral note, a condemnation. You maintain the historical reality of Adam's transgression, or you are outside the orthodox boundary. This decision did not emerge from fresh examination of the Genesis text. It was not the result of patristic scholars reading the Hebrew and concluding, after rigorous analysis, that the literal reading was clearly correct. It was a political and institutional decision made in the context of specific theological controversies to enforce one reading by declaring the others inadmissible. The allegorical tradition did not simply fade away. It was formally excluded, made into heresy. And what had been the standard reading for educated, philosophically formed interpreters of Scripture became, after 418, not just an alternative reading, but a dangerous one. I want to tell you about a night in my study, late, past midnight, on the basis of how quiet the street outside had become. The kind of quiet that makes the ticking of a clock you normally do not notice suddenly audible. I had been rereading Spinoza's method, the analytical procedure, the way he approaches a text. He reads it in the original language. He asks what the text actually says, not what the tradition tells him it means. He notes contradictions. He notes grammatical peculiarities, and he follows them wherever they lead without prior commitment to where they should lead. This night I had been reading his treatment of the Genesis accounts, the two creation stories, the different divine names, the irreconcilable sequences. The lamp on my desk cast its usual yellowish circle. The tea had gone cold in the way that tea always goes cold when I am reading. I invariably forget to drink it. Outside, nothing. And something crystallized that had been forming over years. Spinoza was not attacking Genesis. He was not doing what his enemies accused him of, destroying the authority of Scripture. He was restoring it to what it had been for Philo, for the rabbis of the Talmud, for Maimonides. He was peeling off the institutional layer, applied at Carthage in 418 and reinforced for a millennium after, that had reduced these texts from philosophy to biography, from wisdom about the human condition to records of historical events. And the irony that kept me sitting there in the Norwich quiet is this: the literalization diminishes the text. It makes it smaller. A story about a man and a woman in a garden is a story about two people and their choices, bounded, historical, specific. But how Adam is the symbol of human consciousness, as the bearer of what it means to be a creature formed from earth and oriented towards something beyond it. That is a story about every person who has ever lived, every person who has ever felt the pull between appetite and reason, between the immediate and the longer orientation, between the serpent's logic and the recognition that some choices foreclose others. The symbolic reading is not smaller, it is infinitely larger. Spinoza saw this. He saw that the institution, in its drive to make the text serve institutional purposes, had made the text smaller than it was ever meant to be. And then there is the proof, not in modern scholarship, not in Spinoza's analysis, in the tradition itself. Talmud Bavli, Sanhedrin 37a. One of the most famous passages in all of rabbinic literature. You may know it in translation. Whoever saves a single soul, it is as if they saved an entire world. But the passage does not begin there. It begins with a question about why Adam was created as a single individual. And the Talmud's answer is this: so that no one can say to another, "My father is greater than your father." So that every person knows that the world was created for their sake. So that the greatness of the Holy One may be understood. For a human being mints many coins from a single mold, and they all resemble each other. But the Holy One minted all people from the same mold of Adam, and yet no one resembles another. Read that again. The Talmud is using Adam as the single mold from which all people were made, not as the biological ancestor from whom all people descended, not as the first individual in a genealogical line, as the mold, as the type, as the representative image of the human being from which all human beings take their form, while differing in every particular expression of it. If Adam was simply the first historical individual, the passage would not work. The argument would not make sense. A mold is not an ancestor. A type is not a progenitor. The Talmud is making a philosophical argument about the unity of humanity, about the equal dignity of every person, about the singularity that underlies diversity. And it makes that argument by treating Adam as a symbol of the human condition, not as a historical individual whose personal choices affected his biological descendants. This is not a modern reading. This is Sanhedrin 37a, the document that preserved and transmitted the Jewish interpretive tradition across 2 millennia. The rabbis who compiled the Talmud understood what Adam meant. They understood what the Genesis narrative was doing. They preserved that understanding in their tradition. It was always there. In the text, in the tradition, in the grammar of the original Hebrew. Spinoza was not dismantling Genesis. He was restoring what Genesis had always been. Not the biography of 2 people in a historical garden, the name of what you are, and the story of the choice that has always been yours. If Adam is the symbol of humanity, if Adam is the image of the human condition, of the being formed from earth and oriented towards something beyond it, of the intellect in its struggle with appetite, then the story in Genesis is not diminished by that reading. It is fulfilled by it. A story about 2 people who made a mistake in a garden, and whose mistake we all inherited against our will, makes us victims of someone else's decision. It gives us no agency. It places the origin of our condition at a remove, in a history we did not make and cannot change, but a story about Adam, about the human creature, about you, about the part of every person that knows the difference between the serpent's logic and the orientation towards something more. That story is about the choice you make today and tomorrow. In every moment when appetite and reason face each other across whatever garden you are standing in. That story does not diminish you. It names you. Adam from Adama, the human from the earth, the being who came from the soil and who carries within them the image of every other being who came from the same soil, different in every particular, stamped from the same mold. The church covered it for a reason. The reason was institutional. The institution decided at Carthage in 418 that the smaller story served its purposes better than the larger one. You know the larger one now. What it says about you, about what you are and what you have always been, is worth sitting with for a while. Take care of yourselves.